The story of the museum, as it has been and as it's evolving now, can perhaps be told best by the people who work in it and care for it.
The great thing about this museum is that it is a world museum. That is to say, it draws its collections from all over the world, and it welcomes people from all over the world to see those all together. So you see all humanity here. I remember coming to here as a small child and having the faintest idea what half the things were. But you wandered around with your eyes wide at some of these spectacular things, and maybe you only pick on one that appeals to you for quite, as it were, spurious reasons. I mean, it doesn't matter what it is. It's just enough to get your fingernails into this world, drag yourself into it, and wander about in it, wide-eyed, enthusiastic, and thrilled.
No.
Okay, it's my turn.
It's perfectly right. Okay, right, well, we'll disqualify that one.
One of the rich things about the museum is that people come with their professional expertise, but often with incidental interests as well.
No, you don't need, he's safe, you don't need to do that.
It's not likely there'll be another curator who is crazy about board games for another couple of hundred years, but it won't matter, because when that person is appointed in 200 years' time and opens the dusty box, which I'll leave somewhere hidden, they'll have a great time going through them all and trying to decide why I didn't write labels for them and that sort of thing.
And then I'm going to put it on there, and you won't be able to take that one either.
I think what happens to people who've been here a long time, you suddenly realise that you've actually become the strange people that you met in the past, who were there when you arrived. And I assume and hope that this will actually continue.
What you get in the museum is proximity to the objects, and I think nothing at all can match that. But to actually stand beside a stone statue, or to walk around a stone statue, to almost feel the reflection of light off it and heat off it, is a great study, I believe.
Victor Harris has lived in Japan, is a fluent Japanese speaker, is married to a Japanese woman, and he teaches kendo. His assistant, Paul, studies with him both in class and at the museum. Both are passionate about samurai swords.
In Japan, traditionally, kendo, or swordsmanship, has been a spiritual study, as indeed has been the subject of the Japanese sword. This is an example of the fully developed, curved Japanese sword. It was made by the master smith Yoshikane of Bizen province, present-day Okayama prefecture, around the end of the 12th century. It's made by a very sophisticated technology of repeatedly folding the steel over and over and over and over again. When the blade is finally formed into its sword-like shape, it is coated over all with a layer of clay. That is partially removed along what is to be the cutting edge. The whole is then heated to the colour of the moon in February or August and plunged into a bath of water. When the blade is polished, its intrinsic beauty is visible in the very many varied shades, hues and textures of the crystalline structures along its edge. The beauty in this sword was not contrived by the smith. It was a kind of a joint effort, if you like, between the smith and the gods of the forge, or the smith and nature. Now, if you look at the pot with a natural ash glaze, we'll see something similar. We'll see this very high temperature kiln technology, which was introduced to Japan around the 5th century, about the same time as steel technology came from China. We will see a similarly uncontrived natural beauty on the object. So this shigaraki ware pot, this sword, and perhaps rather more ethereal, a Japanese calligraphy by an enlightened artist, are perhaps the three objects which are at the heart and soul of the Japanese culture.
The British Museum houses one of the world's great collections of art and antiquities. It has nearly 7 million objects from all over the world, from prehistory to modern times.
It's one of the busiest spots in the museum, so one does need to get in quickly when one can.
And the Elgin marbles.
Elgin marbles are in room number 8. If you go to the middle, turn left and go straight across.
When it was founded in 1753, it was the first of its kind. Not a collection in private, royal or church hands, but one which belonged free to the people.
The British Museum was founded in the middle of the 18th century, I think for two reasons. First of all, there was a collector who collected quite manically, a man called Sir Hans Sloane, who was a physician, and he was interested in everything he came across. He created a huge collection of something like 85,000 objects, and on his death, the collection was left to the nation. Now, at the same time, in the middle of the 18th century, it was the age of the origin of encyclopedias. And I think that Sloane and the trustees of the museum amassed a vast number of objects to make the natural and the artificial world understandable, in the same sort of way that an encyclopedia makes the world understandable, but through, in this case, the medium of things.
The first building for the new museum was Montague House, one of the finest private mansions in London. Buckingham House, now Palace, was rejected on the grounds of cost and inconvenience of location.
One of the things the museum never quite got round to in the early days was publishing its own guidebook. So this is by the Van Riemsdyk, and this is in fact the museum's first pictorial guide, which in fact does refer to that noble and magnificent cabinet, the British Museum. It's quite gruesome because it actually has rather nice woodcuts of various objects from the Sloane collection. There is actually the vegetable lamb, which the Van Riemsdyks didn't exactly fall for because it was an obvious fake, but it was supposed to sort of grow on trees.
The museum's collections expanded quickly. Egyptian sculptures, including the Rosetta Stone, came in 1802 after the defeat of Napoleon's army in Egypt. Elgin's Parthenon sculptures came in 1816, and as the collections grew, so did the public's interest.
The museum has always been open to the public. It was obliged to be under the British Museum Act. But I think our idea of just what constituted the public has varied, and also idea of what you should actually do for the public. So the big thing at the beginning of the 19th century was actually opening on public holidays when the public could come, which was regarded as sort of, really not something we ought to do, because then you'd get sailors and they're sort of women from the dockyards, and there'd be a riot.
But the museum's fears were unfounded, and it soon embraced the new 19th century ideal of education and enjoyment for all the classes. In the 1840s, Montague House was demolished, and the trustees commissioned architect Sir Robert Smirke to create a brand new neoclassical building with an inner courtyard. In the new building, even children were allowed.
The present building was largely designed in the 1820s, and it was designed at a time when perhaps 100,000 people were expected every year to come to the museum. And we're getting about 5.5 million people a year, and so it's 55 times more than at the beginning of the 19th century, and quite honestly the museum simply isn't big enough for the number of people who want to come and see what we have.
The opportunity for expansion came with the departure of the British Library, when the museum ran a competition for redevelopment of its newly liberated space. Architects Foster and Partners won the contract.
In 1850, the original architect, Robert Smirke, made an incredible courtyard. His brother came along a few years later, 4 years later, and created this incredible library with a dome which is bigger than St. Peter's, bigger than St. Paul's, I mean, vast scale. But almost continuously thereafter, the space in between that building and the courtyard was filled up. So, in a way, we were rediscovering something from 150 years ago, bringing that back to life.
Yes, and of course that was made possible because you can see here on this aerial photograph, the orange here shows where the library occupied space, which is nearly half the total buildings. So when they moved north to their new building in St. Pancras, it liberated not only the courtyard, but very importantly the spaces to the north and to the east.
Whereas the original courtyard was open to the weather, the new Great Court is to have a revolutionary glass roof.
We're talking about a space that is about 100 meters north-south and about 70 meters east-west. You can fit the main facade of Buckingham Palace into that long elevation, so it's a big, big scale. And there was a problem set by Smirke, because the round reading room is not symmetrically placed in this rectangular courtyard. It lies further to the north. And so we were looking at really what might be described as a net that we could throw sort of gracefully over the whole of the courtyard, with a geometry that would flex, change to cope with these asymmetrical conditions.
The roof is a lattice structure using 3,000 meters of steel, with no one piece of glass the same size as another. The roof attaches at the center to the rim of the round reading room.
The round reading room was a highly innovative structure when it was built in the 1850s. It's a lightweight cast iron structure, and what is quite fascinating, although we're looking here at the copper cladding for the roof on the outside, inside the dome is finished in really what today we might call papier-mâché.
But this lightweight construction had its drawbacks. When they inspected the dome after the library left, the restorers found 2,400 meters of cracks, caused by over 100 years of varying temperatures. A new kind of bandage was invented to cover the cracks and cope with movement in the dome as the temperature changes.
Because of the huge amount of movement that we're getting on the building, this probably has to incorporate around about 2 millimeters of movement on each of the 2 millimeter cracks. So something like this is the amount of movement that we're expecting the whole thing to see.
To the north and underneath the Great Court will be education and exhibition spaces, and new permanent galleries will mark the return of the ethnographical collections to the museum from the Museum of Mankind in Piccadilly. The ethnography department collects not only traditional but contemporary works.
Now these are some recent acquisitions, some brand new objects that we've bought for the African Gallery. In fact, these I bought myself in Ghana earlier in the year. This, as you see, is an elephant. Perhaps I ought to mention it's also a coffin. This is a relatively new art form. People always think that museums are about old things that people don't do anymore. But we're very keen to make the point that there isn't a line between ethnography and what people actually do in Africa, and we're quite keen to document new forms as they arise. This is something that came up in the 50s from a place called Teshi near Accra, where there was a US base, an air base, and somebody's granny always used to watch these planes taking off and wanted to go in one, so when she died, he made her a coffin in the form of a jet. And it's sort of taken off, as it were, from there. And also, well, a Mercedes is quite a big number in Ghana, so you could have one in the form of a Mercedes. There are a number of coffin makers who've grown up in Teshi. This one came from a workshop called Pa Willie's 6 Feet Enterprise. And we were very lucky to get this. We only got it actually because the dead man turned out to be too big to go in it. Some bloating disease, it was explained. So we were able to get this. These coffins are, in Western terms, not really that expensive. You can get one for a few £100. Of course, that's a lot of money in Ghana. Pa Joe is more expensive. He made the elephant. Because he's got a certain international following now. These pieces are becoming known. President Carter paid a visit to Ghana, and he went along to the workshop and bought a coffin in the form of a peanut, there being an association between him and peanuts. And Pa Joe is just waiting for President Clinton to turn up because he's got a few designs for him. These are masks from all over Africa, east, west, south, and so on. We decided not to categorize things by area or period, so you find the most diverse masks side by side, and also really old masks like this one, and brand new ones like this one, really trying to break down some of those ways in which Africa has traditionally been seen. Western museum curators tend to think of African masquerade in terms of carved wooden headpieces. Once you've collected the carved wood, you've collected the artistic element. But in fact, of course, it involves the whole body, it involves music, it involves the voice, it involves dance. Very, very often, the actual carved headpiece is the least important part of it, and at the end of the masquerade, you may even throw it away. So one of the ways that we get round that is by showing figures like this by the African artist Sakari Douglas Camp, which shows a masquerade in full fling. This is a Kalabari masquerade called Bekinaru Sibi, Big Ship on Head. And Sakari Douglas Camp is an artist who was born in Africa, has trained as an artist in the West. So she forms a nice bridge between Africa and the West.
Be very exciting to have the videos playing alongside the sculptures.
It's so seldom you actually get the chance, you know, to see the actual piece and then to have the film of it actually being performed.
We always worried about pinning natives to the wall, didn't we? Mm. And now we've got it instantly without a nail. I think museums, especially the British Museum, are encouraging contemporary artists to work with the materials that are on display and in the storerooms. I mean, contemporary artists are having conversations with traditional objects and, you know, reacting to the museum situation. So it's new ground almost, because we're breaking into the museums. A lot of the people that are displayed in museums aren't extinct. We're alive. Kalabari people are alive and changing. And I think it's the connection with contemporary life, with life, that is the essential part of museums. And they're getting that.
It's much easier actually to answer the question of what is a museum like than what is a museum, because that gets sort of abstract. And I suppose the three classic answers are: a museum is like a bank. You know, you keep their precious objects locked away. Or a museum is like a church. You know, it's a guardian of eternal values and truths. Or a museum is like a forum, a marketplace, you know, a place where all sorts of people come with all sorts of ideas and swap them. And I think it's that latter one that's closest to what we both see as what a museum is about.
And we even managed to track down the original light fittings, one of the earliest electric light fittings in the country.
October 2000. Norman Foster and Spencer de Grey are 2 years into their building work. Behind the hoarding in the entrance hall, the Great Court is beginning to take shape.
So here we are.
Wow, what an explosion.
It is amazing.
If you can imagine coming in on axis.
Yes. So you go from that rather dark space there into this great light space here.
The roof might look like it will have a hothouse effect, but Foster's have made it energy efficient. It's designed to provide some warmth without overheating.
You look up, you see the clouds, you see the movement, blue, white, the sparkle on the glazing. Very difficult to imagine that really something like 30%, only 30% is transparent. So you're getting all the benefits of the kind of artificial sky and contact with the outside and natural light, but you're not getting all the solar gain, which is very good news.
Norman Foster is delighted with the new roof, but there's one aspect of the development which isn't going so well. The south portico of the Great Court is a new structure based on Robert Smirke's original, which was destroyed in earlier changes to the museum. The British Museum and Foster's intended to use Portland stone, from Portland in Dorset, to match the stone used in the courtyard. The stone they ordered was prepared in Portland and arrived in the museum in March 1999. But in the same month, the Heritage Lottery Fund received an anonymous tip-off that the stone being used wasn't Portland, but a French limestone called Anstrud Roche Claire.
At that stage, the museum trustees then immediately commissioned a chemical analysis from the building research establishment, which demonstrated that indeed it was Anstruthe stone that was being used. This is a piece of typical Portland stone. It looks very almost monochromatic, generally light greyish colour, some subtle hues, some slight brown hues in there. And this is quite typical Portland stone. Occasionally you can pick out some grey flecks, which are pieces of shell naturally present in the material. But overall, very, very little to see in this material. Move on to something like the Anstruthe stone, and you can pick out many more of these bits of shell, slightly darker grey materials present in the stone. So from a distance, yes, the two stones look very, very similar, but as you move closer and closer and start looking at the geological features, you start to see more and more differences appearing.
The company contracted to obtain the stone and build the portico was Eastern Masonry. The owner, Jeff Smith, has given his first interview about the portico for this programme.
We commenced the project with the intent of using Portland stone on this Grade 1 listed building. I mean, when the original Smirk building was built, he had a choice 150 years ago from over 50 working quarries, whereas we had a choice from one potential quarry. He had over 20 years to build it, and we had 14 months from order until completion of manufacture. Unfortunately, the quarry only had a few stones, so we had to look elsewhere to fulfill the contract. And the specification clearly didn't just name Portland stone.
The specification was not strictly for Portland stone, but for oolitic limestone, Portland stone from the base bed, or similar. It was a phrasing which surprised one of the quarry companies on Portland who had tendered for the job.
There's thousands, hundreds of thousands of different oolitic limestones around the world. If you just ask for oolitic stone onto a building, you'd get all sorts of different colours. You can have a patchwork quilt. I think that the specification was poorly written. It gave an opportunity for a company to substitute an alternative stone onto the project.
Eastern Masonry provided several pieces of limestone for inspection at the start of the project.
Samples were approved by English Heritage, Camden, historical advisors, ourselves, and the museum. And everybody believed it was Portland stone. And indeed, in one sense, it did come from Portland. I mean, we inspected, everybody inspected it being carved in Portland.
Did you ever at any point mislead anybody as to the stone you were using?
I've been told not to answer that question.
We had confirmation that the stone being used was not the Portland we had been told by early June, and in September that there was a lot of press coverage of it, and the museum made it perfectly clear that it knew that the stone that it was using was not Portland stone, but had decided to proceed with it. We had also tested the texture and the strength of the stone, and the alternative for us was to look at trying to obtain Portland stone, knocking down what was already about a third built and had been about a year in the preparation of the stones to bring them on site. And our decision at the time was to proceed on the basis that the stone was a fine one, the construction was looking very good, and we did not think that delaying the project was in the circumstances justified.
English Heritage agreed that the museum could go ahead with the French stone. Portland stone wouldn't have matched the original weathered stone anyway. But there were other problems.
It also became evident that there were a whole series of problems to do with the workmanship of the stone as well, in particular joints appearing in the wrong places, and the quality of the carving. The carved detail was not the sort of standard you'd expect to find had Portland stone been used.
English Heritage ordered remedial work and postponed their final judgment until the portico was finished. In the meantime, the museum is deciding what will go into the Great Court Concourse. There are plans to display a number of monumental sculptures from the collections.
This is the colossal lion from Cnidus, weighing some 7.5 tons, and it's very important as an original Greek sculpture of the classical period, and it is one of the great treasures of the classical collections of the British Museum. It's also important as an archaeological document of tomb decoration in its period. It originally crowned a monument standing 100 foot high and was seen principally from boats sailing by 200 feet below that. So he's carved to make an impression from a great distance. His nose is very strong, his eyes are hollowed to be set with coloured glass, and he has these very pronounced chunky tufts of hair in his mane. And currently we're preparing him for exhibition in the Great Court so that he looks his best, cleaning him and designing a new plinth, always remembering that he's going to be seen by more people than ever before. And the other thing we're doing at the moment is looking at the monument from which he comes to understand better the relationship between him and the tomb from which he fell at some point in late antiquity.
We believe that most of this rather unsightly grey staining is pollution which attacked it when it first arrived here in the 1850s. I'm applying a poultice, which is laponite, which is a synthetic clay, completely inert, which is mixed with water and it forms this gel. And if it's then applied over this very fine Japanese tissue and left for, depending on the amount of staining, a certain length of time, possibly up to an hour, sometimes longer, in this case it won't be, it actually draws out of the surface dirt particles and superficial staining.
The lion was discovered in the mid-19th century by the archaeologist Charles Newton and brought back directly to the British Museum.
Charles Newton was a pioneering giant of the 19th century and is now a hero of the history of archaeology. He excavated in Asia Minor, which is Western Turkey, between 1856 and 59, and made so many discoveries that generations of scholars like me have been kept busy for a lifetime interpreting and cataloguing his finds. He was, for example, the very first archaeologist ever to use the new technique of photography in an excavation. And these show the lion where it was found among the ruins of the ancient tomb at Cnidus. I've been back to Cnidus this year, and in collaboration with a team of Turkish archaeologists, we're excavating in the ruins of the ancient city from which the lion comes. On a previous trip, I relocated Charles Newton's Sanctuary of the Muses, and this summer I re-excavated it and discovered that it's in fact a sanctuary of the nymphs, a nymphaeum, which dates to the middle of the 2nd century BC. By revisiting the places from which the museums acquired objects, we can build a better knowledge of their ancient context. In order to reach the place where the lion was found, you have to sail down the coast from the ancient city to the promontory and clamber up the rocks onto the ramp down which Charles Newton's men brought the lion to the water's edge. It's 300 meters long and took 100 men a month to build. And further up the promontory, the scene is pretty much as Newton left it, with the promontory strewn with the ruins of the tomb which the lion once crowned. The tomb consists of a square basement enclosing 12 burial chambers. Above this rose a Doric facade with engaged columns, and between a pair of them, a single shield. The whole thing was then capped with a stepped pyramid roof crowned by the lion. Who the tomb was for, we can't say. The shield perhaps indicates a victory monument for fallen warriors. And when it was built is also a problem. Our best clue is perhaps the lion itself, and comparing it with the style of other lions from another great tomb at nearby Halicarnassus, the mausoleum, we can date it to around 350-300 BC.
You can see there is some staining in that, and it may have to be reapplied, but the grey comes off on the damp swab once it's been loosened. And we're getting down to the paler colour that we've achieved elsewhere. Quite filthy.
Conservators are the unsung heroes behind the scenes in a museum. They acquire objects, they look at them carefully, they clean them, they put them together, stabilise them, and then restore them. It's a sort of four-stage process, but not necessarily every stage, every time. Occasionally we make replicas for display, such as the copy that we're currently making of the head of Amenophis, one of the Egyptian pharaohs, and the original head is destined to go into our new Great Court. But in fact, it's also been promised for a travelling exhibition to America next year. And so we're making a copy to go into the Great Court while the original is away.
The conservation and scientific research departments are world-renowned, and through their expertise have earned trust and rewards from foreign governments.
At the moment I'm surrounded by a collection of Nabatean textiles, which came from an excavation in Jordan a couple of years ago. This was a rescue excavation because of tomb robbing, and bits of 2,000-year-old textile were blowing about on the surface of the desert. And because we've got a wealth of expertise in the conservation of archaeological textiles, we talked to the Jordanian Department of Antiquities and made an offer to conserve the whole collection if they would present some of them to the museum at the end of the process. They will, of course, choose the best pieces for exhibition in Amman, and we will be left with the rest to go into our new textile centre, which is due to open in 2003.
So here we are in the round reading room, another of the 7 projects. Incredible.
In the round reading room, the restoration has gone very smoothly. The bandaging of the papier-mâché has been done, along with painting, gilding and renewing of windows.
For the first time, you can start to see the relationship between this space and the roof and the sky outside.
Absolutely.
The round reading room was conceived as a universal library, where at least one copy of every book published in Britain would be held and be available to readers. Library visitors had to have a reader's ticket, so not anyone could come in off the street. Some of the most influential names in literature and history read and wrote here.
For very many years, readers had to sign a signature book, and in here we have a number of signatures made by Karl Marx, where he says that he's read the directions respecting the reading room and declares that I'm not under 21 years of age. This is written in 1874, and when his daughter Eleanor was trying to get a reader's ticket herself, she wrote to the museum and said, I don't know what I'm supposed to do about references, but if it helps, my father, Karl Marx, came here daily for almost 30 years. So in fact, in many ways, this is the birthplace of Marxism. Back in 1984, when Gorbachev first came to the UK, we took him through the reading room, and he did actually comment to one of the students that if anybody wanted to complain about communism, they ought to blame the British Museum.
Apart from volumes by famous readers, the library will contain books relating to the museum collections, and at the lower level will be available to the public. There will also be a modern edition which may shock some of the past readers. At the centre of the room will be 55 computer terminals carrying Compass, a new multimedia system which will carry family-friendly information on objects in the collections.
What we're looking at is an animation of one of the astrolabes in the museum's collection, so that we can explain how an astrolabe was used for telling the time and for navigation. Each object has a good deal of text written by the curators and edited by the compass team here, and it allows you to see objects moving in cases where the museum wouldn't normally like to move them and disturb them, and almost to handle them, which obviously visitors to the museum wouldn't normally be able to do.
The system also contains guided tours, from gladiators and Caesars to mummies in the afterlife.
So do you want to look at anything in particular?
Well, I'd love to have a look at the Royal Games.
The information for the Toys and Games tour has been supplied by curator from the Ancient Near East department, Irving Finkel, who's seeing the results for the first time.
The most fantastic collection of things here.
Irving Finkel has spent 21 years looking at the objects in the museum and has made some surprising connections.
The Royal Game of Ur arrived in this museum in the 1920s, and nobody's known how to play it, although lots of people have tried to work it out. And then about 10 years ago, I discovered that one of our cuneiform tablets has on it rules, enough information that we can work out how the Sumerians really played it. Let's see if it's really where it's supposed to be after all. Right. Here's our tablet. It's got two sides of writing. One is very unusual because it's ruled into boxes on the one side. The other side has got lots of cuneiform writing, very closely packed and hard to decipher. And then here, we've got the real rules, which tell you about the dice and the pieces and how you play the game. It's a race game, which is, of course, the biggest family of games, ancient and modern, really, where you have equal match sides racing around a track. And this board came from a grave at Ur, and it belonged to a member of the royal family, and it was made in about 2600 BC, so that's quite an ancient thing. And the tablet was written in 177 BC, so there's quite a time disparity between them. But what this tablet, what this cuneiform inscription tells us is not only the significance of these squares here, but the fact that people used it for wagers and for bets. And what happened was, when you moved your pieces, if they landed on one of these marked squares, that was very good news, and you won something out of the pool. But if you had to jump over them instead, when you wanted to land on them, you had to pay the same penalty. And the scribe who wrote it had a peculiar sense of humour and draws a kind of metaphor that the pieces were soldiers, and the fate of the soldiers, the things that made them happy or unhappy, was how he put across what the fate of the pieces was on the track. It's a very unusual activity to write a piece of rules like this. One of the sources of evidence for the historian of games is scratched boards on the pavement, sometimes in chalk, sometimes done with a blade or something in the ground. And they're the sort of thing that people walk over and never think about, but when you look at them analytically, sometimes they're very significant. What we have here is an Assyrian bull. It's one of our prize exhibits, and it used to stand in the gateway of an Assyrian palace at a site called Khorsabad, and it was made at the end of the 8th century. And a few years ago, an American colleague wrote to us because she was writing an article about the hooves of these monsters. And so she asked one of my colleagues to come down here and measure the hooves because she needed the details. So she came down with a torch to investigate it with a ruler, and while she was doing so, her eye was caught by this slab of marble here. And she discovered, completely unexpectedly, that there was a grid for the game carved in the rock here, where the soldiers must have played when they were on guard. And it's a wonderful example of the real use of the game in daily life. It's nothing to do with kings and burials and all that sort of thing. It's real life use of the game. And there's another aspect to it which is rather wonderful, because it's not often that you can use textual evidence and archaeological evidence so closely together. And we have the board itself, we have the writing about the game, and here we have, completely unexpectedly, this great monument here with a bit of evidence that you can pull together into the same picture. And that's one of the amazing things about the British Museum, that when you have an idea, an investigation, you can pull bits of evidence from all directions and make them somehow into a solid, convincing argument. So I'm very fond of this monument, I have to say.
Well over, put your head over.
The cleaning of the Cnidus lion is finished, and the delicate task of manoeuvring it into the great court begins.
Didn't fancy putting it outside?
Well, I don't think it would be practical, but he looks very well outside.
Yeah.
And against these columns, it looks fantastic.
Oh, yes, and where's it come from?
Southwest Turkey. He's been in the museum 150 years.
Right.
So he's at home.
Right. You come in as far as you can. Rob? Yeah. He's going to come in as far as you can. That's it. Good night.
That beanstalk thing's not coming over this way.
No, it's not. It can bloody work round the line.